an education-related question that is an interesting conundrum that is dealt with in the halacha, but actually comes to an important question about the nature of education and at least one type of a mindset to education. And we're going to use a analysis of this week's parsha to try and dig a little deeper into that. So the question I have is as follows. There are certain times when you have a bracha, a blessing that's meant to be said. Often a blessing that's said on food or drink. Most commonly, you have situations where the blessing is said on a mitzvah that has food and drink associated with it, like Havdalah, where we have a cup of wine, Kiddush, you have a cup of wine, etc. What's interesting is the times in which you may have a conflict between the mitzvah that you need to do and the bracha or the requirements that happen. So I'll give you an interesting example, although the halacha will go in a different direction. We have a practice that we don't drink wine on the 9 days. We have an exception when it comes to Shabbat. On Shabbat, you are allowed to drink wine. But when it comes to the 9 days, during the week, we don't drink wine. Okay. What happens when it comes to Havdalah? When it comes to Havdalah, usually we make Havdalah on a cup of wine or a cup of grape juice. What happens when it comes to, they're coming up very shortly, Shabbat ending. Shabbat ends during, once you get to Havdalah, you're already in the weekday period. The weekday period, you're not supposed to have wine. But you want to make a blessing on the wine. What do? So there's all sorts of different suggestions. What's called Chamar Medina, use a different beverage. This is the one time that often people make Havdalah on beer or on orange juice or on Coca-Cola. But there is one issue that's raised, and this is what I wanted to have a little bit of a catalyst of our discussion. One suggestion that's raised is have a child drink the cup of wine. You make the bracha, and you have the child drink the cup of wine. Now, the question here is, what message are you sending there? Let's think about this for a second. We know that we have an overarching obligation known as chinuch. We are not required simply to do the mitzvot, but as role models, whether it's through parenting or through role modeling in the community, we have an obligation to educate about mitzvot and about the values that are consonant and connected with the Torah and the mitzvot. So what exactly is the message you're sending in terms of chinuch, in terms of the education that you're giving? Which is that generally what we're supposed to do is supposed to role model mitzvah, right? That's the idea that when you have a lulav, you try to buy a lulav and you arrange for a lulav even for a child. We sell these chinuch sets that or whatever for kids. You try to role model and give children the opportunity to do mitzvah. Here, what you're doing is you're bringing a child up, saying, please, you have on one hand, you want to make sure that the bracha is not in vain. You made a blessing on a cup of wine. You can't drink the cup of wine because of whatever reason. So you give it to the child. And let's say it's grape juice. Forget the alcohol for a second. But you give it to the child, and you, on one hand, are sending a message that the rules don't apply to you. On the other hand, you're maybe sending the opposite message of saying, we must make sure that we follow all the laws of brachot, of blessings, and never make a blessing in vain. And therefore, you drinking the wine allows us to not make that blessing in vain. And so, the message here could be somewhat nuanced. And often nuanced messages, especially when it comes to kids, are confusing. Is the right thing to do to say, you know what, we just won't have a cup of wine. We won't have regular Havdalah because we don't want to be in a situation where we're basically giving a child something which, according to the letter of the law, is forbidden. On the other hand, you say, okay, it's not forbidden for a child. And we have lots of different examples where we don't hold children to the standard of doing mitzvot, right? Children generally don't fast. They don't do all sorts of other things that become obligatory once they reach bar or bat mitzvah. But this happens to be a flashpoint in the discussion about chinuch. about educating and the messages one sends in education. And the Rashba, and I don't have the text here. Again, I'm happy to stop for a second if you have thoughts. What's the right thing to do here? Is it the right thing to do to give the child the cup of wine while saying, this is actually illegal right now because it's the 9 days, but for you it's not illegal, or for you it's the right thing to do, or you're allowed to, and you're then for educating them, maybe that in the future they can have it. Or trying to thread the needle. It seems like a somewhat a mundane issue, but ends up being, again, a catalyst about everything that we do is role modeling and educating. So again, I'm happy to take a break if there are those who want to chime in and what you think the right thing to do here is.
Rabbi?
Yes, Rabbi Green, yes.
Who exactly are those people that even pose such a question?
So it's interesting. It goes all the way back to the Rishonim. The Rashba, and I'll see if I can, I had it here and I'll try and see if I can bring it up a little bit later. The Rashba quotes Yesh and Yesh, different approaches to what you should do when he raises the issue of having a child drink the cup of wine, which may satisfy the halachic details, but may be sending a complicated message when it comes to chinuch. By the way, we mentioned last week, there was a similar conundrum when it comes to lulav. When it comes to lulav, there's an issue if you give a child a lulav. There is a problem because there are nuances within the laws of acquisition that a child is not able to do. And the laws of acquisition govern who owns the lulav. And the child can accept but can't necessarily give it back, or the other way around. And so one suggestion was that maybe you just give it to the child, but in your mind, you don't fully give it. But again, the same issue was raised, which is you shouldn't necessarily play what they call in Hebrew trikim when you come to the education of children. And that's the issue that the Rashba raises. Yes, so Miriam, let me see if I can unmute you. Give me a second. Miriam, you just need to unmute and then we can hear you. Yes, go ahead. Oh, we lost you again. One more time. One more time, you need to unmute. There you go. Got it, perfect.
A couple of things come to my mind, not very profound at all, but I'll just share them anyhow. One is the Havdalah ceremony is very beautiful. It's very short, and I am not in favor of skipping it because you have these problems with it. I'm in favor of doing it. My question is this: are you allowed to leave out the part of Borei Pri Hagafen? Can you leave out the wine part of it because it has the nice Besamim idea? It has Shavua Tov attached to it. So I would not like to leave it. The second part is I don't like the idea of giving a child wine. Nothing to do with their drinking alcohol at a very young age. They're not going to become an alcoholic if they're 7. But I don't know if they'll like the taste of this.
So we can use grape juice, but yeah, I hear your point.
As sweet as it is, it has this alcoholic taste to it. I don't want them to not like the wine.
I hear you.
So that you're setting something inside of their salivary tastes, and it's not going to like the wine. And to me, that's negative.
I hear that. Okay.
A couple of other thoughts, but I won't express them now.
Okay. So I actually wanted to point, but the point that Miriam made is maybe change the ceremony, but then you may have the same issue of you want to educate them about what the ceremony actually is. And maybe, okay, so you talk about it's different for this week, but this is the background to a analysis that I want to do over the text of this week's Parsha.
Right.
Yes, go ahead, Alan, yes.
It would appear to me that the way to handle the child who's drinking the wine or the grape juice or the schnapps after the wine and the grape juice after Havdalah is to explain to him the entire sequence that the halacha is that we don't drink wine during the 9 days, but the halacha is that we don't want the wine to go to waste because of a bracha, and therefore the halacha is that someone who is otherwise exempt from mitzvot, a cotton under bar mitzvah, is the one who drinks the wine. So to use that as a vehicle not to escape the obligation of drinking the wine, but on the other hand, to use it as a vehicle to train the son or the daughter in three separate halachot that apply in these circumstances. So it's
I
a
love it,
training
yeah.
vehicle.
Exactly. Using this as a teaching moment. Absolutely. And that actually, the Rashba does not mention that, but later commentaries do, and I'll see again. Hopefully we can try and get to them. But that's actually part of what I wanted to see and use. The source of your answer is found in an analysis of this week's Parsha. And I guess we'll skip to the end just to be able to frame it, which is that Moshe is defined as Rabbeinu. Moshe is defined as Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe our teacher. And interestingly, the Avud Raham suggests that part of the reason why Moshe is our teacher is exactly your point, which is to try and make everything into a teaching moment. And again, there's an analysis of this week's Parsha that I want to bring out that idea, which I think is very profound. And it starts with this. This is, again, one of the most cryptic Parsha, other than perhaps the 19th chapter of Shemot, one of the most cryptic descriptions of a story in the Tanakh, because we know sort of a synopsis in our head, and I'll review the synopsis very briefly, but if you look at the manner of the text, you actually see something very odd. The story is of the transfer of property on the other side, so to speak, the other side of the Jordan River, to the tribes of Reuven, Gad, and half of Manasseh. Now, again, just the synopsis of things in our head is we know that Reuven and Gad and half of Manasseh took a portion of land outside of the land of Israel. And again, if we just remember the story, they come to Moshe and they ask for a place because they feel that this is better for the livestock that they have, so they want to have it on the other side of the Jordan River. And Moshe says, whoa, you can't just ask for it outside of the Jordan River. You must commit to serving as the vanguard of the Jewish army as we conquer the land of Israel. You can't just sit here and leave it to the people to go and fight, and you sit around here. You need to go fight, and they in fact do, and they serve as the vanguard of the Jewish people's army and leave there, and then end up receiving the portion on the other side of the Jordan River. That's the basic story. However, what we're going to try and do is do a little bit more of an analysis of that story. And again, hopefully, just let me know, but you should see where it says Parshat Matot at the beginning of the end. Hopefully you see that. If not, I'm sharing the wrong screen. But there actually is, again, a lot of seemingly unanswered questions that I think all lead to the point we're going to try and show. And so let's try and read and look at the story with a little bit of that critical eye to be able to dig deep, beneath the surface to what actually is being taught here. So it says here, the descendants of Reuven and Gad had an abundance of livestock, very numerous, right? Right? It's a great place for livestock. So the descendants of Gad and the descendants of Reuben came, and they spoke to Moses and Elazar HaKohen, saying, if it's okay, please, can we have this land? Don't take us across the Jordan. Now, I want to ask three questions. The first is, we just see Reuven and Gad. Where are half of Manasseh? Right in our mind, when we think about this story, it's Reuven, Gad, and half of Manasseh. Where are half of Manasseh? We don't see them mentioned here at all. The second is really brought forth by the next paragraph, right? So again, for the request, this is their request. And interestingly, the Torah doesn't just jump into their request, but it lays the foundation and the groundwork for why this is a reasonable request, right? They have a lot of livestock. There's a beautiful place in Gilad for livestock, and therefore they make this request. And again, they ask if it pleases you. They ask politely. Listen to Moshe's reaction, Pasuk Vav. Vayomer Moshe l'vnei Gad l'vnei Reuven, hachechem yavo lemilchama v'atem teshvu po. V'lama tiniun et lev b'nei Yisrael me'avor et haaretz asher natan lachem Hashem. V'hinei kam, and I'm skipping a bunch of psukim. Kamtem tachat avotechem tarbut anashim chataim. Behold, you have now risen in place of your fathers as a society of sinful people. You can hear the angst and anger and fury in the voice of Moshe when you read these words. Ki tishuvun me'achav, you're turning away from following God, and he'll leave you in the desert again, and he will destroy this entire people. Talk about a furious reaction. Right? And by the way, if you take a look just as a side point, we start in Pasuk Vav. Pasuk Vav is the 6th Pasuk. You go to Pasuk Tet Vav, 15th Pasuk, and this is nonstop, a tirade against Reuven and God. And it gets to the second and third question. You know, why is this such a terrible request? It's not like they are like the Meraglim. They didn't disparage the land of Israel. They didn't, the Meraglim said, oh, we shouldn't go. We should go and return to Egypt. They didn't say anything like that. Why are they compared to that? You know, if you look carefully at the request they had, they said, Al Tavireno, don't take us across the Jordan. But the likelihood is that they would have probably, it doesn't say they wouldn't have sent their soldiers. Again, they ask respectfully. They say, Im matzanu chen be'einecha. And I'll take you even further. They're not disparaging the land because the physical geography of where they ended up is probably equally commutable, so to speak, to holy places like Yerushalayim, much closer than the Hermon or the Golan. They probably are able to, access many holy places even more easily than those who were on the quote-unquote right side of the Jordan River. So sort of the second question is, was what their request was so bad that it warranted this explosion of fury that comes from Moshe Rabbeinu? The accusations that Moshe make don't seem to be founded in the text that they said. Again, they said, oh, don't take us across the Jordan. But, and Moshe starts with this, how are you going to go, let your brothers go and, go to war and you're going to sit here? Again, maybe they wouldn't have. And the accusation of this is trying to corrupt the minds of the land of the Jews of Israel and try to get them away from God. That seems, again, a little bit overblown than just a simple request. So, by the way, there are some Mefarshim who, and the Abarbanel seems to take this general approach, who say that Moshe was so angry because he saw the seeds of all of his complaints in what they were saying. He says, if one tribe decides they don't want to go into the land, that's going to cause everybody to denigrate the land. And if one tribe doesn't seem as excited about the war, then everybody's going to be excited about the war, and you guys are sending the wrong role modeling message. But other Mefarshim just, again, it's so a little bit of a perplexed approach why Moshe was just so furious. So that's our second question. Again, the first question is, where's half of Menashe? Second question is, why did this warrant such a, as they say, going ballistic, powerful response against the children of Reuben and Gad? And the third is, let's take a look at what happens next. What happens next is, so they volunteer to fight in the war, and we'll go and we'll even be the vanguard. Don't worry, we won't come home until we take care of everything. So they, get the message, they volunteer. And then you see that somehow, and again, I'll see if but Moshe just basically says the same thing again, and they repeat, they repeat their request, and then at the very end, Moshe actually gives them what they want. So the third point is, this back and forth is very perplexing, because they seem to just repeat the same thing over and over again with very little change, and he ended up getting what they want. If what they requested was so horrific, so terrible that it reserved, a half a dozen or a dozen verses of, of fury against them, then you would be surprised that actually was the end of denouement, is that they actually get what they're asking for. So those are three questions I want to kind of try and understand and analyze in this story, because I think, again, it teaches us about the message that Alan suggested at the very beginning, but also but because, again, it seems to be a cryptic story that, as they say, Omer Darshani, there's got to be something beneath the surface. And so that's what I want to explore. Okay. So what I'd like to present as a thesis here is that the protagonists of the story, or I would say the intended a recipient of the story, is not Reuven and Gad or even Appa Menashe, which we'll see later. The intended audience of the story is you and I. And what Moshe is doing is giving a master class in education. He is doing a practicum. He is showcasing a methodology of how to educate. And this isn't just about children, it's about, again, role modeling and educating it. And so what Moshe is doing is he actually tries a variety of different methodologies where he lays them out and uses this as a teaching moment to the entire Jewish history who are going to read this story to see his methodologies as he is Rabbeinu. And by the way, that will answer the last answer, which, you know what they asked for wasn't so bad. And they're going to actually end up receiving it. But the process of their education through this conversation is actually the goal of what we're meant to learn. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so there are subtle differences between each stage of what goes on here, right? So Umikne Rav, first, again, the Torah lays out how this is actually a reasonable request, and I would say that the thesis is that because this next few parts of the story are not about the request. They're about the educational methodology. They're about, again, the point that Alan made, the teaching moment. So the Torah starts off by saying they're actually asking for something that is reasonable. But the Moshe needs to role model for them what it means to plan your future as a member of a community. So the first thing Moshe does is he tries the unequivocal message of the sledgehammer over the head. The first thing he tries to do is the sledgehammer over the head to the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven is, whoa. The first thing you must do whenever trying to make any request is think about something bigger than yourself. And so Moshe goes at them with both barrels, needs to give them that wake-up call, and says, you know what? It doesn't say anywhere in your request, Reuven and Gad. It never says anything in your request about your brethren. Look what it says, Matzanu chen be'enecha. This is a personal conversation between us and you, Moshe. If we found faith in your eyes, Yutanat Aretz Azot Lavadecha Lachuzah, give it to us as our inheritance, Al Tavireinu et Hayardei. So the first thing that Moshe he tries, method number one is the sledgehammer. And that is the, wake-up call and reminder that there need to be certain basic elements in the way that you plan your future as a people. And the fundamental first element must be think about something bigger than yourself. Now, did they refuse to go? Were they planning on abandoning the people? Who knows? I would even argue likely not. But again, this is a masterclass here. Moshe is starting with that message of, you know what? You need to totally reshape your approach, your attitude, an attitude adjustment, so to speak. And so the first tack Moshe uses is that sense of, take a step back, take a deep breath, and reshape the way you're thinking. And so that's the background to the first approach that Moshe gives. So the reaction that happens to Moshe is that Moshe offers is a very calculated reaction to show them that if your approach is one that purely thinks only about yourself, I'm giving you an extreme vision of where that can lead. That you can lead to the Meraglim approach, you can lead to the abandonment of God. It can lead in the wrong direction. So we need to give you that wake-up call. But then Moshe realizes and knows that that cannot be the be-all and end-all of education. If education is purely with the sledgehammer, then it's not education. If education is purely with that, harsh approach, purely of setting the stage to, rising emotions of fear as the catalyst for good behavior, that's going to be an incomplete and likely ineffective approach. Which is why immediately Moshe changes his tack. The first tack works because it reminds them, whoa, we got to totally revamp our attitude. And that's what they say. Vayikshu elav vayomru, kedronot miknenu varim letapenu, v'anachnu nechalei tzchuchim l'pnei bnei Yisrael asher b'yanu mem lekomam, v'yashav tapenu barei mitzar mipnei yoshvei haaretz. Oh, we will then arm ourselves quickly, we'll take care of stuff, and we'll arm ourselves and go before the children of Israel. They offer to be the vanguard, right? The front, acharai, until we brought them to their place. We should not return to our homes and teach our children of Israel as to take possession of his inheritance. For we will not inherit with them on the other side of Jordan beyond, because our inheritance is on this bank of the Jordan. They clarify exactly what's going on, but they make it clear that that we got message number one. But again, that is only the beginning of education. Let's go to the further. A dozen psukim or so later, they repeat the final agreement. They repeat exactly what they said before. Except it isn't exactly what they said before. And here is the difference. Let's start with Pasuk Tetzayin, the famous Rashi. What happened? What does the Rashi say? Vayikshu elav, they say to Moshe, Kidvro tzo nivne lemikneinu po v'arim letapenu. What are we going to do? We're going to build houses for our livestock, and then we will build shelter for our children, for our families. Okay. This is a mistake that is a question of values, right? Because what do? Rashi tells us, which comes first, our money or our families, right? There are two mindsets, the mindset of practicalities and the mindset of values. I can pursue wealth because I want to be rich, or I can want to support my family and do good, so therefore I pursue wealth. So Moshe tells them, or I should say, the mistake number one is they put Gidrot Tzon first. That's what Rashi says. Second mistake. What do they say? Va'anachnu nechalei tzchushim lifnei bnei Yisrael ad asher havinu benotam. We are going to take a vanguard position in the army, lifnei bnei Yisrael, in front of bnei Yisrael, ad asher havinu mekomam, until they arrive at their location, at their place, when they get their inheritance. There's also a slightly nuanced value statement here, which is this isn't simply another land and another place where the Jewish people are meant to have a patch of grass. This is the land that God has promised Abraham and has been part of our heritage and destiny for thousands of years and for the rest of all of our history. This is a place that is infused with godly energy. It's not just Nechalei Tzchutim Lifnei B'nei Yisrael. It's that there is a sense of godly destiny which we can't sit out. And so we need to be part of. It's not just a battle for real estate. It's an approach to try and be part of a godly destiny. By the way, just as a side point, there was an interesting debate over the famous song about Hanukkah. You're familiar with the song. And it was a debate because some of the thinkers at that time, when it was written, were upset that it's all about Gvurot Yisrael, right? Who shall sing the songs of the warriors and the glory of the warriors of Israel, that they are the Giborim. And what about God? What about God who assisted them? That's not part of the song. So it's the same kind of thing, that same approach. And V'anachnu Chalei Tzchutim Lifnei B'nei Yisrael. Now, here's something interesting. Let's skip to the final agreement. What do they say in the final agreement? Vayanu b'nei Gad u'bnei Reuven lemor, et asher diber Hashem el avadecha kein naaseh. Nachnu na'avor chalutzim lifnei Hashem. We say, we shall do as the Lord has spoken to your servants. We shall cross over in an armed force before Hashem. They get the message. They include the godly nature of what the Jewish part of destiny of entering into the land is all about. They include that this is Lifnei Hashem, not just Lifnei Yisrael. And they, in fact, describe the change in their approach to they also change that. They fix that in that they say, we put our rights before our responsibilities. I'm sorry, our responsibilities before our rights. What are they, right? Nah, up until this point, they said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to set up our homes, and then we're going to go fight. Here, what do they say? Nachnu na'avor chalutzim. They raise and they explain their responsibilities. V'itanu achuzat nachlatenu. And secondarily, they talk about their rights and their requests. And so, over the evolution of this conversation, it goes to starts with the people who are clueless about what they got, a dozen psukim, to a point where they somehow now are very nuanced and very subtle in terms of their revamped messaging. Now think about how it's happened. What happens between the clarification and the final agreement? What does Moshe say? What does Moshe do? You know what the answer is? Very little. He reframes their statement. He, talks to them practically. But you know what is missing right here? Any hint, right? In between the clarification and the final agreement, any hint of anger. Any hint of what we saw replete over here. Because the second stage of education is what I'll call the subtle messaging. The gentle prodding. The, again, education as opposed to simply punishment. Moshe, what he does, and again, if you'll just give me a second, I'll try and bring the text here of how Moshe reacts. But Moshe, what he does is, instead of yelling at them like he did a minute ago, he says, okay, we've gotten past that. Now what I need you to do is come to a realization on your own about the values and the messages that you need in order to be able to make this request. And this is so important because this is their message to what they're essentially setting up as diaspora Jewry. They're saying, we're going to chart another path. And Moshe is saying, that's fine. But it is extraordinarily important that when you chart your path of the future, that you do it with exactly the right values. because you're going to be going on a different path. You're going to be on the other side of the Jordan. And therefore, you need to make sure that your value system is rock solid before you go on that. And therefore, you need to, express yourself in the sense of that rock solid value system. And so what Moshe is requiring of them is for them to reframe. And even when they get the point that they're not allowed to just drop off here and live here and let everybody else go and fight, they still need a little bit more nuances and understanding about what they're supposed to have as their values in terms of what they're supposed to approach their family. How do you live a life that balances the needs of family, of community, of parnasa? You need to understand that. They need to understand how you bring that balance of rights and responsibilities and what comes first. Your responsibilities before your rights. Finally, they get it. But my point more is that they get it not because of what was said, but it's because of what wasn't said. About how Moshe realizes to get where I really need you to go, the sledgehammer isn't going to be the way it's going to happen. And so that is, seeing the evolution of Pasuk Hey, which is, please give us, all the way to Pasuk Lamed Aleph, which is, we understand our rights, our responsibilities, they come first. We understand what role that we need to play in a godly destiny, Na'avor Lifnei Hashem. We understand about the role that we play as connected to the community, Na'avor Chalutzim Lifnei Hashem. We understand what type of families we need to build, what type of responsibilities we need to have. And that took time. And so, again, we'll stop here for a second. I'm going to try and bring up that text to elicit your reactions and your thoughts. But I, again, feel that this is Moshe laying out to posterity these different methodologies of education and showing what works first. Because if you start with just the sledgehammer, you know what you're going to get? You're going to get a immediate reaction that isn't thought through, that still needs a lot of work to get where you want to go in terms of trying to get that end result of the person you're modeling for or you're educating. And so you must have a much more subtle approach to be able to get where you want to go and get that end result of what I call, again, that teaching moment. So Moshe is doing the ultimate of what we started with. Moshe is turning what seems to be a mundane request, a reasonable request. That's what the Torah starts in the very first pasuk, and bringing it into something that's meant to be an eternal class, internal modeling of education. So again, we'll just stop right here. I want to try and show a little bit about how Moshe did that, but I'm happy to get your thoughts and questions at the moment. Let's see, stop the share. Let's see. Yes, you can unmute. You can unmute. Let's see here. Here we go. Let's see the whole chapter. Bamidbar Lamed Bet. Here we go. Okay, yes, here we go. So that's the thesis I want to show. And now what I want to try and do is show how Moshe did that. Okay? So we saw that the first way he did it was with the sledgehammer. Now let's look what he says next. Pasuk Chaf, right? That comes. What does Moshe say? Vayomer Alehem Moshe. Let's just see here. Let me get the share up. Sorry. I'm sorry. You gotta get it all here. There we go. Vayomer Alehem Moshe. Moshe says to them. This is right after they say their first, what we described as a little bit of a mistaken approach. Im ta'asuna tavar hazeh, im techaltzu lifnei Hashem la milchama. What does Moshe do? He models for them what to say first. You don't say, first I'm going to go get my own stuff. I'm sorry, you don't say this is just for real estate. You go, it's lifnei Hashem. Va'avar lachem kol chalutz al Yarden lifnei Hashem ad rishat avotav. V'nir b'sha'aretz lifnei Hashem ba'achar sheshvu v'yitim mekim v'yitaretz azot lachem la'achuzah lifnei Hashem. So Moshe does not yell at them, does not sledgehammer. He models for them what they should be emphasizing, which is quoting Hashem, that it must be before Hashem. And it must be, and it says that no less than 5 times, lifnei Hashem, and it must be, again, their responsibilities before they list their rights. Then what does Moshe say? Then what do the people say? The people then say, Vayomer b'nei Gad al b'nei Reuven, Avadecha yasu kasher Adoni mitzaveh, tapenu nashenu mikneinu v'chol bentenu. What comes first? Our children and our families, and then our parnasa. So again, you see that through Moshe modeling what their priorities should be, they get the message and it's much more effective. And even then, it needs to go a little further. They need to, Moshe once again says to them, what do you see here? Again, Vayomer Moshe Aleichem, Im Ya'avru b'nei Gad u'bnei Reuven itchem et ha'Yarden, kol chalutz lamelchama lifnei Hashem, v'nichbasha ha'aretz lifneichem, u'nitatem et eretz ha'gilad. What does God say? What does Moshe say? All right, no problem. He simply reiterates exactly what they had said, but what does he do? He talks about first their responsibilities, and then he gives them their rights. That is what finally allows us to achieve a totally different request all the way in verse number 31 than we had in verse number 4 and 5. And that, by the way, leads to our last point. So the first point we made is, you can start with the sledgehammer, and maybe that sledgehammer allows you to completely wake someone up for their slumber of their mistaken attitude, but only if it's then followed up by a role modeling and a subtle approach. And then we want to end with one last point, which is the other thing you got to do. You got to set them up for success. And that is actually, again, we don't have time for all of these sources, but that is the suggestion that many of the Mefarshim have for why the half of Menashe was added. The reason why half of Menashe was added was because, and let's see if I have it here. So the reason why I have it was because when you have 2 halves of a tribe split, one on one part of the Yarden, one on the other part of the Yarden, they're going to make sure to communicate and connect with each other. They're part of that same family. That's going to make sure that there is a continued connection between, so to speak, the diaspora and those in Israel. And so what is the third point? First is make sure you're very careful and nuanced in the way you build your messaging as part of education. The second is set them up for success. Create an environment where your worries, what is the main worry whenever you have a group of people split off in another direction? They're going to be distanced from the rest of the community. They're going to be split up and become their own people. So what does Moshe do? He sets up Menashe. And again, what we have here, we don't have time, but we have here is a reason why that was Menashe's fate. But he sets up Menashe to now be a bridge between the Jews on both sides of the Jordan River. Once you have constant caravans and communication between one and the other, that is a bulwark against the communities being split. And that, I think, is sort of that last point in education, which is do everything you can to create an environment where success is assured and the worries that you have are mitigated. So what does that have anything to do with the Rashba having to do with Havdalah? I think actually, let's just see if I can.
Rabbi, can I interrupt you here for a minute?
Please.
So I'd offer a different interpretation as to why Menashe is just
Okay.
the other half of Shevet Menashe is only brought up the end and not in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason is because the criticisms that were leveled against Reuven and Gad were that you were leaving your brethren alone, you weren't going to conquer the land, you would put all of your cattle and monetary goals in front of your obligations to the rest of the nation. You couldn't make that argument to Menashe because Menashe was only half the tribe. The other half of the tribe was doing all the things that they were supposed to do. So it's one thing to blast the guys who are doing the wrong things, but not blast Menashe because they were doing their share. But then when the consent was forthcoming, to give the consent not only to Reuben and Gad, but to Menashe as well.
So you're suggesting that Menashe were actually part of the original request, even though they weren't mentioned in the pasuk.
They were part of the original request, but they didn't abrogate their responsibilities. They recognized their responsibilities. Half the Shevet was going to take on the responsibilities of the Shevet. They were going to go ahead and go to the land and do the conquering and keep it to the hearts, and they weren't going to put their their desires ahead of their responsibilities.
Yeah.
So the Shevet was doing its share. So when Moshe was being critical, he was being critical of those people who deserved to be criticized. But Menashe didn't deserve to be criticized.
Yeah, great point. Great point. Again, and it's interesting to bring some of those messages. You could add that maybe part of what Moshe was trying to do in leaving out Menashe and everything but the very end, according to your approach, is also be very tailored and careful in the way in which you offer some, prodding and criticism. So again, yes, Miriam, go ahead.
I was waiting for others to talk. I spoke already. I'd rather hear others. But I will say this. Every time I read this portion, I'm disturbed. And that's okay. I'll never find a solution, and I'm not looking for one. And there are passages of the Bible that sometimes kind of disturb me, but not to a great degree. I am thinking of a bad analogy. Most people will disagree with it. I am thinking of Vietnam. We went into a war for no reason. We had no rational reason. People said, I will not go to Vietnam. What if I lose my life and I have young children at home? What will happen to them? There were protesters who made no dent until many years later after they protested it, after we lost at least 50,000 Americans, but we killed even more while we were there. And we're still looking for a reason why we ever went there in the first place. Surely not to stop communism, because the next year Nixon went into a communist country and befriended them. So I am presented with my own problems here. I'm going to share them, but if you have a solution, good. I'm not looking for it. These tribes were made to feel totally not part of the group, totally selfish, because they did not want to fight with the others. And therefore, God became, as you say, furious with them because they took such a purely selfish attitude. After all, these were the cities, this was Canaan that God had promised to Israel. This was the promised land. We were going into a promised land. We don't talk about our losses, but we talk about how easily we conquered these terrible cities because they prayed to idols, they were immoral, etc., etc. What did they ever do to us that made us go and conquer them except for God's promise that this would be our land? And so these things bother me. They don't have to bother anybody else. I'm sure they don't. but I just wanted to share something in my young years that I read this again and again. I'm in my 90s. I'm still bothered, and it's okay
There
if
you
I'm
go.
bothered.
There you
Thank
go.
you.
Absolutely. Always great to hear your thoughts and your insight, Miriam. We're going to stop here. I want to thank everybody, and hopefully the sort of the broader message, and I it's not necessarily exact halacha, but that just to conclude with, what Alan started with, which is, I think, exactly the correct answer. The idea is that Havdalah is a nuanced situation. It's can be seen as a small little thing, and the engendered conversation the same way. This could be just simply a request of one people at one part of the time, and there are bigger things that got less treatment over the course of Tanakh. But exactly like you pointed out, that when you have clashes or challenges or questions of values, instead of whitewashing them, ignoring them, use them as that teaching moment. Explain to the child, well, there's the 9 days and there's the this, again, to the extent that that child has understanding. And again, use some of these methodologies and these approaches, exactly what Moshe did. Moshe didn't see them as a simply, people requesting. He saw them as his children, that he wanted to impart a methodology of education, which is why he took all these different tacks and all these different approaches to be able to share this messaging with them. And I would say the job he had is to, seed that to us. Halacha isn't simply halacha. It's meant to be that guideline and that methodology of the way we approach ourselves and the way we approach each other. And hopefully that not only gives us guidance, but it gives us inspiration as well. Wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom. Everyone stay safe.
Shalom.
Stay safe out there, wherever you may be. And I look forward to seeing everybody soon.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Absolutely.